A few minutes, I'm going to introduce Daniella, who's our discussant, and then also introduce Professor Southall. We have an issue with the other respondent, Nonkululeko. She was supposed to be sending her video because she couldn't join us, a pre-recorded video. It seems she's having issues, but we'll continue with the discussion. As soon as the video comes in, we'll play it much later. And I think the nice part about having all this technology, is that we have now various ways in which we can conduct these discussions. So Daniella Rafaely is a lecturer in the psychology department at the University of the Witwatersrand. She's also my friend, and we are writing a book together. So her teaching focuses on critical social psychology as well as advanced qualitative research methods. She joined WITS at the start of 2022 after completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Daniella's current research interests, they encompass various discourse analytic methods to study subaltern or marginalized South African groups, including most recently, a study on African migrants in South Africa, as well as a study of representations of farm killings in the media from 1994 to the present. And I don't know if Roger needs any introduction, but I'll just take this intro here from the book that we'll be discussing today or tonight. Roger Southall is an emeritus professor in sociology here at the University of the Witwatersrand, and he's a professional research associate at the Department of Politics and International Study at SOAS, London, UK. He's the author of The New Black Middle Class and Liberation Movements in Power, and now adding to the long list of material that he has released, Whites and Democracy in South Africa. So over to you, Daniella. You have like 15 to 20 minutes, and then afterwards we'll give it to you, Roger, for a response to what Daniella would have said. And then afterwards we'll have a Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Buso. I have to start by saying that the invitation to comment on the work of such an esteemed author, as well as someone who I have such personal, deep scholarly respect for, has been a daunting prospect. Nevertheless, I hope that my comments will be useful in highlighting and mobilizing discussion around some of what I take to be the significant contributions of Professor Southall's book. The book sets out to tackle the question, what has been the role of white people in South African democracy? To do this, Professor Southall uses data from 8 focus groups held with different socioeconomic groups around the country, crafting his analytic insights along the vast theoretical knowledge of the economic and political state that is a hallmark of his work and that is evident throughout the book. What has been the role of white people in South African democracy? The question that is posed, although vulnerable to critique, is an important one. First, it legitimizes a discussion that may often be felt to be unnecessary, unwanted, or undeserved by white as well as Black South Africans. Second, it reframes the contentious and troubled topic of race relations within the political context of South Africa's transition to democratic rule, providing a useful theoretical lens from which to unpack these difficult concepts. Third, it provides an entry point into a complex and comprehensive discussion of historical, social, economic, racial, and of course, political aspects of life in post-apartheid South Africa. Finally, it opens up a space for examining whiteness as a heterogeneous and multifaceted subjectivity that contains its own flaws and inconsistencies. The subject matter, as noted, is certainly vulnerable to critique. Why study whites? Haven't they been central in so much research already? Why not devote the time to studying previously marginalized groups that are still so deeply under-researched? This thought ran constantly through my mind when reading the book. The question, however, itself points to a zero-sum mentality that is so central to South African life, including the notion that everything given to whites has always necessarily been at the expense of blacks. Although this has been patently true of many or most aspects of our society, I think that this book is an important step in starting to move away from this kind of thinking towards an approach exemplified in Professor Southall's temperate writing that provides space for studying the complexity of our reality, away from the polarizing and extreme positions that characterize much of the race talk in our country. Professor Southall tackles this painful, contradictory, and contentious topic with nuance and complexity. One of the aspects of the book that I most appreciated was the deep humility with which Professor Southall approaches his subject matter. This came in through his balanced and empirically grounded discussions of difficult topics, such as white complicity, reparation, transformation, and importantly, non-racialism. What is non-racialism in the context of South African democracy? The subject is an important thread running through the text, where it is variously defined as suggesting that race should no longer matter, that racial considerations which are not corrective of past racism should have no legal or political bearing, that the salience of race should disappear, that the South African state and society should be demographically representative. Non-racialism also has a contentious history within the liberalist tradition, where it is sometimes understood to enable the legitimization of continuation of structures of oppression that favor whites. By mobilizing different understandings of non-racialism, in contrast to Africanism, rainbowism, and multiculturalism, the book foregrounds a central dilemma underpinning the very formation of a democratic South African nation. On the one hand, the Constitution's pursuit of non-racialism implies a country in which race is not a salient characteristic. On the other, the Constitution's requirements for equality demand that blacks be provided with active opportunities that were systematically denied them under apartheid. Is non-racialism possible in circumstances that demand racially organized reparation? If democracy relies, as the book suggests, on racial equality, should we aspire to a non-racial society? The continuing significance of this question was made evident in the media over the last few days, in which the CEO of Discussants was decried as being racist for placing a moratorium on the hiring of whites in order to reach demographic equity targets in his company. The arguments and discussions on the topic suggest that these moments continually reassert the fundamental tensions that are tackled in this book. Without explicit attention to racially driven equity and reparation, the country seems destined to reproduce itself along existing lines of racial and economic inequality. Paradoxically, it seems that only by undertaking these racially organized measures can we achieve the constitutional ideal of non-racialism. Perhaps Professor Southall can spend some time in his discussion commenting on the contested meaning of non-racialism and its implication for the democratic project in South Africa going forward. For me, the book was a page-turner, an uncommon experience when reading an academic text. As a white South African, growing up in an Orthodox Jewish home that was underpinned by what I now recognize to be a kind of passive racism, I've grappled endlessly, as I'm sure many other whites have, with my place in the country. Too young to understand what was happening when apartheid was dismantled in the 90s, I've nevertheless benefited from the racial structures put in place by the apartheid government. As I read the book, I recognized my own experience, my own contradictions and discomforts stamped on every page. The book takes us on a journey from early colonialism to segregation and apartheid, and then beyond that to the democratic transition and into present-day South African experience. It carefully contextualizes many of the important moments in our country's history, from the formation of the Union to the writing of the Constitution and the first democratic elections, to the exposure of state capture, the civil unrest in KwaZulu-Natal in 2021, and the effects of COVID on the economy. All of these moments are explored through a political lens that consistently poses questions about our current democracy, how we have come to it, and where it is headed. Professor Southall uses a study of post-World War II Germany as a comparative perspective for examining how people manage feelings of guilt, blame, and shame in the aftermath of crimes against humanity, in which they've either participated personally or not. This discussion will surely resonate with many people who have been the beneficiaries of structures that favored them, as well as those who have been discriminated against by those structures. Professor Southall describes many whites as reluctant Democrats, but in contrast to much of the polarization surrounding current debates on the state of South Africa's democracy, he provides a balanced and cautiously hopeful set of conclusions framed by discussions on democracy and the need for a viable opposition, expropriation without compensation, and affirmative action and transformationism that he accomplishes with delicacy and a faithful empiricism. Although Professor Southall notes that it was an uncomfortable book to write, the book avoids the self-indulgence and soul-searching that might be expected in a text that grapples with such personally salient subject matter. The tone rather is factual, but in many places painful to read. As he notes, the difficulties of unraveling an unwanted history should not be underestimated. Professor Southall's authorial voice throughout is restrained and non-moralistic, with only very small glimpses of his own feelings about the data he analyzes. For example, after recording a particularly racist response from one of his focus group members, he notes that racist responses such as these were mercifully few, with mercifully offering the only clue as to his own personal orientation to the data. The lack of outrage and judgment is valuable. Its result is that space is provided for the reader's own experience of the material. It's a form of authorial generosity that is not always common, especially when it comes to complex or politically charged content. Another of the questions I want to pose to Professor Southall is, in a publishing career that is focused largely on the country's Black majority, where did the impetus come from to write this book? Why did you write it? Why now? And what was it like to write it? For myself, the book provides a refreshing and much needed nuance to a topic that I've largely encountered as involving blaming, victimization, overwhelming guilt and shame, apathy and disinterest, resentment, fear and anxiety. It's difficult to talk about being white in South Africa, and this book provides an important addition to the discourse surrounding whiteness in our country, providing space for paradox, contradiction, pain and hope. I want to end with a quote from the book in which Professor Southall reflects on Achille Mbembe's observation that non-racialism in South Africa is a utopian ideal. He notes, "The ideal of non-racialism embedded in the Constitution is right. It is important to stress that there is nothing wrong about that. Utopia by definition is unobtainable, yet its importance lies in prescribing a society's normative aspirations and its call for perpetual striving towards their realization, even though the journey can and never will be completed because of human fallibility." Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Daniella, for that moving reading. We have a recording from Nonkululeko, so which is great. I'm going to just introduce Nonkululeko and then play the recording from her, and then you can come in after that, Roger. Nonkululeko Mabaso is a PhD candidate in development studies and holds a master's in sociology. She's a teaching assistant in the sociology department. Whiteness studies is one of her central research interests. Her master's research studied the lives of poor white people who live in the township of Krugersdorp. Her doctoral research relates to racialized economic power in South Africa and wealth and inequality. So we'll just play the video now and just listen to Nonkululeko, and then over to you, Roger. Thanks.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I trust that everyone is well. I would like to thank the organizers of the event for inviting me to comment on the book and to be part of this discussion. I would have loved to be there in person, but I do welcome further conversation about the book and my discussion through email afterwards. I would first like to start by, I always like to start by prefacing my especially when it comes to books or like any academic content about whiteness, to first preface my discussion with the reminder to myself, at least, and the author and the audience, that I read the book as not only a Black woman who does research on whiteness and who has a keen interest in whiteness studies, but also as a Black woman from a lower working class background. And I think this has a bearing for my approach in terms of and the way in which I experience literature and scholarly research on whiteness, and the way in which I analyze the content thereof. I am really grateful for this opportunity to think through and to think with Professor Roger Southall about this very important book. I think the book makes an extremely important contribution to the body of literature that helps to provide an insight into the political perceptions and practices of white people in South Africa post-1994. In the book, the author paints a comprehensive image that could help any reader who picks it up to get a clear understanding of the hegemonic forms of whiteness that have prevailed pre-1994 in South Africa, particularly during the apartheid dispensation. The book also attempts to capture the varied political stances and practices of most white people in South Africa at the time, while also locating these within a global whiteness, Euro-American imperialism, and as well as the decolonization movements on the African continent at the time. The book also provides a valuable insight about how some white people understand their positionality presently in response to the democratic dispensation and the developments in the social and political life of the country over 25 years since the installation of a democratic government in South Africa. I believe that this publication, without a doubt, makes an important contribution to a body of existing sociological and political studies literature that tries to make sense of the place of whiteness post-1994. As we know, the social sciences in South Africa, and I'll use sociology, which is a field that I have particularly a personal investment in my work and in my preference. Sociology, for example, is an example of a discipline, a social science discipline in South Africa that is anchored in studying the lives of Black people at an individual and community and institutional levels. Therefore, there is a gap in knowledge that we have, in the knowledge that we or society has about the lives of white people in the present, especially in contemporary South Africa. And this is one of the ways in which whiteness remains mystified. This is not to deny the existing literature. There is a large body. For instance, scholars like Melissa Stein have made a significant contribution to whiteness studies post-1994 in South Africa. But I would like to simply make the point that there is a need for more of this kind of literature, especially the research that focuses on the lives of white people from the gaze or the perspective of white scholars and the perspective and or gaze of Black scholars, as this, I think, will serve the important function of demystifying the abstraction of whiteness. This leads me to thinking about one of the strengths of the book, which is that most of the basis of the discussion in the book, or discussions in the book, based on the empirical data. The author writes a bit more about having conducted focus groups and interviewed different groups of white people in 5 provinces across South Africa. However, I would have been interested to know a bit more about the demographics of the participants of the study, because I think it would shed a bit more light I'm most interested in the age range of the participants. However, I would have also liked to know about the total number of participants that participated, and other demographic information. Like I said, the age range, their ethnic backgrounds, their cultural grouping, as well as their gender. There is more data in the literature about the political views of the older generation. And I guess this book in particular leans towards, it's an implicit, it's not explicitly stated, but it's implicit in the book that it leads more towards the older generation of white people who transitioned from apartheid. However, the same is not true for the youth. And to put it loosely, the youth, white youth are the future of whiteness. So it would be interesting to know what white youth think, or how they see their political duties and positionalities in post-1994 South Africa. And it would also be interesting to know about the kind of political education that most white and political orientation that most white youth espouse. I think this could help us as scholars, researchers, society, to understand the cultural dynamics that go into generational whiteness. And I speak about whiteness here as the author defines it, which is in relation to a structure of privileges that are accorded people who resemble people who are of European descent. What other, I would have also been interested to know in relation to the question of the white youth, what the continuities and discontinuities are across the pre-1994 and post-1994 generation of white people in terms of how they understand their place in South Africa and in relation to South African democracy. I think the book and the author in the book sets a number of very clear questions, which he adequately answered. And these questions include, or the following questions are asked in the book. Are most white people reluctant Democrats who reminisce fondly on the age when white people used to rule the land in South Africa? What is the role and place of white people in contemporary political life? What are white people in South Africa willing to participate in a non-racial democracy? The next question is, to what extent are white people in South Africa willing to forego the racial privileges of the past and make the sacrifices which are demanded of them? The book also seeks to understand how white people are thinking and behaving politically after, 25 years of democracy. I would like to pose additional questions that seek clarity on the rationale behind the types of questions, or the set of questions that Professor Southall sought to answer and ask in this publication. One of those questions is, beyond reflecting on the past, what did the participants have to say about their present privileges that are associated with their whiteness? I think the book the author kind of dwelled more on past privileges than present privileges. And I would have loved to hear more about, a conversation along these lines, especially what the participants in the study, or even the author himself, believes about one of the arguments that are coming up from our generation of younger Black people is that, we live in a neo-apartheid era, that continues to benefit white people, and where Black people are subjected to similar structural oppressions that existed under the apartheid state. So it would have been interesting to hear what the author believes about this post in the time that we're in right now. Another set of related questions that I have while reflecting on the book relate to the audience that the author is writing to, that the imagined audience that Professor Southall had in mind while writing the book. Who were you writing for, or who were you writing on behalf of? And who are you writing to? Who is the imagined audience of the book, as I said? And in your mind, as the author, what are some of the key takeaways that any reader who picks up the book should walk away with after reading it? And what message are you trying to send about, or are you intending to send about the conditions of white people in democratic South Africa? One of the reasons I ask this is due to the overt insistence in the book that South Africa is currently a non-racial democracy. A final note I would like to make regarding the nature the nature of the white colonial unconscious. The book helps to demonstrate the split and heterogeneous nature of this consciousness or non-consciousness. However, I think there's a need to place a greater emphasis on its contradictory nature. For example, it is possible for white people to advance liberalist and humanist ideals at a personal and political level, while also clinging to and at times perpetuating the privileges of either the individual and the group, or the group that most of them continue to benefit from at socially, institutional, and these relates to social, institutional, and cultural capital. And another questions that I would have liked to see answered is in the book is in relating to the kinds of sacrifices that or trade-offs that the participants in the study were willing to make towards the goal of attaining the reality of a non-racial democracy. I guess the question is not necessarily about whether or not they thought of themselves as willing to make these or any kind of sacrifice, but what could they imagine giving up? And I think this can help us to understand how white people in South Africa imagine their place in the future of the country's non-racial democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Nonkululeko. I hope you will see this recording. I appreciate the last bits of the questions, because I think they also set us into the conversation with the author. Roger, over to you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you both for your comments, which are very helpful. I will let you into a story here that I had 3 publishers' reviewers on this, and 2 publishers' reviewers were broadly favourable. They weren't overboard. And one said, "What a load of rubbish. This book is totally unpublishable, should never see the light of day." So it made me a little bit nervous what the reaction was going to be. I had a WhatsApp from Ivor Chipkin a couple of days ago. He was talking about the book. He said, "What struck me is how whites seem to have reconciled themselves to democracy, just as many in the black political class seem to have given up on it," which I thought was quite a nice indication of the polarization, which I think we've certainly seen in discourse, if not in reality. And of course, that is very uncomfortable, I think, for many of us. And it goes back, Daniella sort of said, where did this come from? And again, yes, I mean, I would have been very surprised 30 years ago when I was sort of demonstrating against the Springboks at Twickenham or something, to think that later in life I'd be writing a book on white South Africans, but there we are. But when a university like Wits decides you're so totally geriatric, you should never allow to be enter a lecture room again, and you think what you're going to do with the rest of your life and where should you go, not being originally South African, it sort of makes you think about where you stand in this country as a member of a demographic minority. Also, by that time, of course, my background, I have usually come from a very different tradition, dealing with, I've always prioritized the study of class over race, essentially. So, and issues of identity, which have come to the fore recently, I think in many ways sort of rather frightened me. I thought, what's the hell's going on here? I'm not used to this stuff. It's treacherous area, I think. And I must admit, I also had something of a suspicion of the literature on whiteness. And I still don't really I don't consider myself a whiteness scholar. I had quite an irritation with some of it. I felt that some of the literature on whiteness, which I read in South Africa, was written by whites trying to prove that they had shed their whiteness, whatever that might be. And a little bit of sense of righteousness and self-justification about it. I also felt that some of the stuff on whiteness in South Africa I was reading, while supposedly taking the history of this country into account, actually smoothed over that history and didn't take into account the nuances and the complications and the differences in this country. So that's sort of what began to intrigue me. And so I had to get into the study of whiteness, which the whiteness literature is interesting. And I have profited from it. But I think just relating to, something else which was raised, the book is, I suppose, really about white attitudes rather than about the political and economic structures of which sustains those attitudes, perhaps. As I was writing the book, I decided actually this was not a book on political economy. I've sort of dealt with that stuff elsewhere, and I had started off talking about, whites in corporate structures and so forth, but in the end it didn't work. So I came back to this other stuff. How do you study whites in this country? Now, how was I going to do this? Well, first of all, I wanted to start off with history, because that's really where I come from. And I was reading around and I came across this notion of Goran Thurborn of the failed settler state in his book on Cities of Power. where he's going around the world. I mean, he must have had a great air ticket because he was talking about the architecture and all sorts of all over the world. It's a terrific book. But he was talking about the history of white settlement, and he's talking about white settlement in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc., and reflecting on the fact that South Africa was seen as a country of white settlement. But of course, of those major countries which were seen by the imperialists as countries of white settlement, South Africa was always the odd country out because of the native question. And those damned natives could never actually be wished away. And I think this leads on to the fact that if we go back to the literature of 20, 30 years ago, we have to recall that that literature was saying that South Africa was on the edge of a race war. Let me just, if you'll bear with me, I'm just quoting from the magnificent book by George Frederickson, which published in 1981 on racial supremacy in South Africa and the United States. The whites, he argued, might well have a place in South Africa in the future. But the nature of this place will depend on the decisions that the white leadership makes in the years to come when faced with increasing pressures from within South Africa and without to dismantle apartheid and enfranchise the African majority. Intransigent opposition to these demands for basic change will only invite race war and could ultimately result in the oppression or even the expulsion of the white community by victorious African nationalists. Accommodation, a willingness to share power and economic resources in an equitable way, might still enable whites to survive as members of a permanent and useful minority within a multiracial strait. The history of white supremacy in South Africa provides little hope for such an outcome. But one of the more general lessons of history is that human groups can sometimes transcend the past and adapt to circumstances in anticipated ways. If enlightened self-interest can induce whites to abdicate their privileged position, they may still be able to call themselves South Africans 25, 50, or even 100 years to come. Otherwise, they may end up in the same situation in which non-whites now found themselves, as disenfranchised aliens in the land of their birth. So let's remind you, he wasn't the only one, of course. If you look at a lot of the prominent sociologists of the day writing about South Africa, Pierre van den Berg, for one, wrote an important book on South Africa. I can't remember the title. In the 1970s, 80s, he was pretty sure we were coming to a pretty grisly end in this country. US policymakers, what was the time running out? All those sorts of policies were sort of assuming that we were moving in this country to a pretty dismal state. So I think one of the things I'm trying to get over this book is that history matters, and you cannot understand whiteness in this country without having a pretty detailed understanding of how the history has shaped white political attitudes and behavior in very complicated ways. And it also comes over very clearly that whites are not homogenous. It's actually quite difficult to generalize. One other reason why I got into this was because during the years of the TRC, I didn't study the TRC in detail, but I was, of course, a colleague who I worked very closely with, John Daniel, was a researcher in the TRC. I became very friendly through the whole TRC network with Kathy Jenkins of SOAS. and endless discussions on the TRC. So I came with that sort of background, more in discursive engagements rather than literature. And when I got to writing on the TRC, to my horror, I found the literature was absolutely vast. I found it necessary to engage with the whole TRC issue because of the questions it raised about white reactions to the past, how they saw it, and how they responded to it, and so forth. And of course, what came out of much of the literature on the TRC was the disappointment of the TRC commissioners and Archbishop Tutu in particular to white response. And of course, President Mbeki, Deputy President Mbeki at the time was pretty angry about it. The ANC took the TRC process to court and so forth. So it raises a lot of issues. So given that disappointment with how whites reacted to the TRC, it was, I think, very important to come back to the focus groups to see how whites, as represented in those groups, were responding to the whole issues raised by the TRC. I'll detour there to the issue of focus groups. And how do you actually study whites? I could simply have gone to a lot of survey results, and I did go to one particular survey results from the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, which are very useful. But those who know me know I'm not really a survey person. If I start counting, I start getting a bit confused if I get over 10. So I thought that focus groups would provide a much more, the stuff I could handle, give me a much more textured handle on where whites were coming from. And I came into the methodology on focus groups as a complete neophyte, and essentially I had to hand the process over to the excellent citizen surveys in Cape Town who are skilled in these sort of things. And it'd be interesting for people to reflect on how focus groups are appropriate or not. I think looking back, what I would like to, I wish I had done more of a trial run before, because of course, once the focus groups were over, I had a lot more questions I would have liked to ask them, but that's the way things go. But I think I found the responses about the TRC from those focus groups peculiarly interesting, because there was, in many ways, a comforting lot of self-reflection. It was less than ideal, in my view, but there was a lot of discomfort with the issues that were raised. tendency for respondents to endorse the trope widespread amongst apartheid's previous enforcers that apartheid had started off with good intention, which for one reason or another, and power corrupts was a common theme, had gone awry. Even so, widespread acceptance of the status of apartheid as a crime against humanity provided a solid base for white respondents' acknowledgement of the cathartic value which the TRC had provided to the victims of apartheid. So lots of ifs and buts, but I came away from that whole issue, I don't know, more comforted than I was discomforted, given where those people had come from. Chapters on disillusion and dystopia. Disillusion and dystopia, of course, familiar stuff to you. South Africa's on the way down under the ANC. There's reverse racism. There's a lot of fear of crime and violence. But I think the most interesting, perhaps, is what I call democracy and the impossible choice. Going back early, somewhere in the book, I talk about, I look at some of the surveys carried out in the mid to late 1980s, and there whites were beginning to recognize that the end was nigh, and that something like democracy was going to happen. And this was reflected very much into this democracy, the impossible choice. A recognition that apartheid was gone, it was done and dusted, was never coming back, that it was going to be replaced by something termed democracy, and that there was no going back from this. But nonetheless, a sense that democracy was bound to fail, and that it was failing in this country. There was a lot of talk about lack of education and so forth. And I do paraphrase this. I sort of have somewhere in there saying, well, actually, political scientists, when they discuss democracy in whatever you call it, emerging countries, whatever the terms are these days, they talk about consolidating democracy. There are grand traditions going back to Seymour Martin Lipset, for instance, about the conditions for democracy. So those things are discussed in a much more systematic fashion. But nonetheless, what was interesting was that when the focus group respondents were saying, well, if not democracy, what? Complete lack of answer, no suggestions of where to go because the question had floored them. But the whole issue, the other issue which I came through was what I call the issue about staying put. Going or staying, white privilege and advantages, political participation. There was considerable recognition of white privileges in many ways. But generally, there was recognition that for most whites, immigration was a non-starter. For a start, immigration, you can't, most people in this room might be able to immigrate. Supposedly, most of us have probably got various degrees and so forth. But you can't pick up your bags and say, I'm going to Australia tomorrow. Well, actually, apart from David Moore, who is actually going to Australia tomorrow. But you've got to get a job, you've got to get through visa problems, you've got to have money, you've got to have contacts, all sorts of stuff. So immigration isn't a practical option for most whites anyway. And maybe that's one factor in whites saying, we're here, we're going to make the best of it. And then it leads on to a discussion which says, actually, this isn't too bad a place. And And it feeds into discussions about those whites who've been abroad and come back. And they say, well, compared with how people are living in those countries we've been to, we're not actually bad, we're not too badly off here. So there was quite a lot of enthusiasm about South Africa and quite a lot of, if I can dare use that term, patriotism. I'm probably talking too long. I have a chapter on the DA and its problems going back to the classic issues of liberalism with race. I have a chapter which I think was the one I enjoyed writing most on Afrikaners after apartheid, because there is now a considerable industry on that subject, some of it good, some of it not so good. But it was very fascinating, and I dealt with the whole issues of, I categorized them: armed opposers, they're dead and buried; the passive resistors, those who move into physical enclaves or into cultural enclaves; the inclusive proponents, the Afrikaners who embrace democracy; and the active proponents. And again, that is fascinating. Those, the solidarities, the Africa forums, who are working in the Afrikaner interest to, in effect, I think some people call it, gosh, can I mention that name? I think R.W. Johnson has called it building a state within the state, using the instruments of democracy for their own purposes. But at one level, you may deplore that. On the other hand, they are using our constitution, which should be encouraged. So again, that can be lastly. I'm going to shut up in a minute. Lastly, I suggest that the white politics is what I term quite probably a politics of defense. Perhaps I won't quote that because I don't want to take up too much time, but I think the politics of defense is something we could talk about. But when I go to my conclusion, and I suspect this is where my critics will start getting excited, I talk about the relative success of a failed settler state, in the sense that although there are lots of ifs and buts, whites have adapted to democracy. They may be, I use the term reluctant Democrats, but I suggest that perhaps because of circumstance, Democrats they are. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Before we go into Q&A, I forgot to mention that we have a limited number of copies of the book sold at a discounted price of 200 Rand, but it would be on a first come, first served because they're quite limited. Now we can go to a Q&A session, but I also have one question that I was really dying to ask, you know. Because Roger, when we read the book on the preface, you start by saying, and I'm building on some of the questions that Nonkululeko asked. You start by saying, this has been an uncomfortable book for a white author who lives in South Africa to write. And today you have also indicated, which that's why the book for some of us was interesting, that most of your work has been focused, you know, the subject matter of your research has always been around the question of class when we look at the political transition. So when you say uncomfortable as an author, you identify with the white race as well. And what do you mean by this? What's this discomfort that because it doesn't come through, you know, because it still remains within the level of this objectivity within the book. And this objectivity also seeps in even in the method, you know, the fact that the surveys are handed out and the focus group are conducted by someone else. Why that? And how did you feel the discomfort, given that you are not even that active within this process? Because I'm thinking of myself, if I write of violence, I'm already within that violence, and I see I'm immense in it. So you are also divorced from it. And also, given, just to add on the question from Nonkululeko, you're also writing from an older generation of scholars who have written on the question of class, but now moving on race. So what does that mean? So I'll leave it there and open it up to the floor for more questions. So I think I'll take 3 for now, and then we hand it over. So you can even ask Daniella if you have a question for her. Thanks. For those joining online, you can raise a hand and then unmute yourself once we recognize your name. Nothing. Okay, so we can start with.
Okay, let's go to this issue of me. You suggest I identify as white. I don't.
It's there, it's written. White author.
Let me go back to actually, you know, when I wrote the book on the Black middle class, I found it in many ways quite an easy book to write, because I was able to reflect upon where I came from. You know, I was born in 47. I grew up in, you know, formative years The issue of focus groups you raised about white youth and the issue of generations. I really was, I'd never done focus groups before, not really. Well, I had things which we call focus groups on the black middle class with Rafaely helping me to run them, but they weren't systematically put together. They were a bunch of people brought together, mutual discussions. So this wasn't, when you have a citizen surveys doing it, they're doing it age, gender, language groups, income group, you know, but I found it actually quite difficult. I wasn't able to do any numerical analysis on that, which would have been nice, but I don't think the material allowed me to do it. But I think what did come through that, and you raised the question about white youth. The question about white youth was brought up forward, and that's particularly important because, of course, around the TRC issue, there had been a lot of discussion about whether the so-called white-born frees would be able to rid themselves of this whole issue about complicity with apartheid. And coming out of that, and this is another theme which I think is becoming increasingly important in our analysis, and it was certainly important in black middle class issue, is this whole business of generations and how attitudes and behaviors are carried forward through generations. And it's this issue whether white youth are going to become, if you like, less racist than their parents, whether they're going to be more prone to a non-racial South Africa. And of course, it comes through with the German paradigmatic experience of it took 2 or 3 generations before we are told Germans started to grapple with the whole issue of Nazi and the Holocaust. And so I think that raises important questions for us here in South Africa. And perhaps it reflects on this whole issue of expectations of whites today. I'm not asking about what is desirable here, but what is sociologically likely. It was always unlikely in 1994 that, hey presto, whites would suddenly become born-again non-racialists. That wasn't going to happen. There's all going to be sorts of legacies of whites' attitudes and white behavior and so forth. So what we're interested in here, I think, throughout the book is the way in which those attitudes may have been leavened, may have changed and adapted, and the way they are justified, and the way they are lost. So again, I don't try to give any great answers in this book because it's too damn complicated a subject. I just simply say it is complicated, and here we are. This is what I've found. Who was I writing it for? That's a good one. I don't know. Well, I was writing it to keep myself occupied during COVID. What else did one do? I've never really thought. It's a good question. Always the expectation that someone reads the books you write. One always hopes so. It's a good question. Who was I? I don't really have a straightforward answer to that one, but probably by default writing to the whiteness crowd. Yeah, writing in response to Melissa Steyn, who of course joined the sociology department when I was head here. She was with us for a year before she went off and did her own thing she'd brought the diversity stuff from UCT. So I got to know Melissa quite well during that year. And her book, of course, really set the ball rolling on whiteness studies in South Africa. So in part, it was an engagement with Melissa's own book on the breakdown of the master narrative, as she calls it. So I haven't seen Melissa since this came out, but that is a pleasure or otherwise to come.
Okay. Prishani, your hand is up, and others? Oh, okay, you're noted. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I'm interested in your conclusion of the relative success of a failed settler state. And I wanted to ask whether you consider the failure of what you're calling the non-racial democratic state a reason for
Sorry,
that.
the failure of the
Non-racial democratic state, a failure for that. And I'm asking particularly in terms of how non-racialism has attempted to be enacted in, since 1994, relying also on those apartheid categories of race that you yourself seem to be uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Roger. I've got one question, right? Well, I've got two questions, sorry. Make that three, Kesala two.
You would.
I've got, the first question is, what is it, right, that you didn't do, right? What questions didn't you manage to answer? Or what areas didn't you manage to put in the book that you think, you'd have liked to have seen come in the book, right?
So I was wondering, I couldn't actually, I'm deaf as a post these days.
Let me do this.
Oh, kill that.
Yeah,
Sorry. Turn again, I was waiting.
Open the volume.
Okay, so I'm asking you, what topics, questions, and things didn't you put in the book that you think you would have liked to have seen?
Oh.
Right? It's a very simple question.
Yeah.
What other kind of like interesting questions or areas of inquiry do you think people can pursue from this? The second question is Afrikaners and the symbolic economy, right? And I refer specifically to you talking about the fact that in terms of like participation in the economy, they've been able to get into telecommunications and the TV industry. DSTV being one example, right? And please forgive me, the kind of trash shows that are on DSTV and Showmax, right? I'm wondering, I'm just really, really wondering about the kind of like choices that people that own DSTV that happen to be Afrikaner kind of like think through and produce the kind of like content that they produce, particularly directed at an audience of Black South Africans. More of a comment, yeah, but there's a question somewhere.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think we can have the two and then.
Prashani, if you ask me what non-racialism is now, I think I'm probably more confused now than when I first started writing this book. I start off somewhere in the introduction talking about the various approaches to this whole question of race, the national question. And if you look at the various approaches to the national question before 1994, we have Africanism, non-racialism, rainbowism, etc. And if you look at the way in which those approaches were formulated, and you're trying to I think, study what has happened to, if I can use that term, race relations today, they actually, I don't think they have much purchase. They don't actually tell us an awful lot. And of those issues, I mean, I think rainbowism has been much mocked, but actually it's the South African version of multiculturalism, of course, of which there is a big literature internationally. But in this country, it's been mocked as being sort of it's hunky-dunky and we all must get on beautifully together. You know, but it's, I suppose it's it's the sort of South African version of multicultural pluralism. So I don't think it should be mocked. I think it should be taken more seriously than it has been. Non-racialism, what is it? Is it the suggestion that somehow or other race becomes completely invisible to us in our daily interactions? Well, it's at one level, it is a utopia in which I believe, I say at the back, I say we as whites, I recognize this. We have to continue to believe, I think, in non-racialism, because I think it is an important ideal, even if I'm not completely sure what that ideal is. Of course, non-racialism these days has come under a lot of challenge because we have the rise, the whole debate around decolonization and so forth has, I think, been a significant challenge to non-racialism, and the whole whiteness studies, I think, has been a challenge to non-racialism. So I think, Bashani, I'm not answering your question very well, but I think that probably the discussion about non-racialism has got to be continued and deepened. And when I talk about the relative success of the failed settler state, remember I'm talking about the failed settler state in the sense that Goran Thurborn was using it. And I think the relative success, and I go back here very much to the issue which I think is come from the present, particularly, if I may use this, black militant criticism of where we are at the moment of the 1994 settlement. But I spend quite a lot of time in the book talking about the 1994 settlement and the compromise. And I talk about that relative success in the sense that I think that much of the present conversation undervalues what we avoided. The transition was pretty violent, but we avoided something much worse than that. We avoided that race war, which was predicted by so many analysts in the 1980s. I say that when we were voting on the 27th and 28th of April in 1994, there was a genocide going on in Rwanda. We've had a war since then in the DRC on our doorstep, which nearly 5.5 million people lost their lives. That hasn't happened here. Maybe South Africa outsourced its race war to Angola and Namibia, but we avoided it here. And I think that is one of the major successes. And meanwhile, whites have done more than survive in this country. They have established something of a place for themselves. Amaswani, what questions would I have put? I can't think of those precise questions at the moment, but I seem to remember that they really have revolved around this whole issue of the difficult issue of white complicity under apartheid, which I think remains an issue of great complication because of it's got so much about class wrapped up in it, in terms of the privileged lives which white people lived, and the whole issue of white engagement with what was going on. There's some very interesting stuff in those focus groups on how whites were responding, why they thought that somehow somebody else was responsible for it. There was quite a lot of self-reflection on how whites, younger people who were young whites then were getting called up into the SADF. And there were one or two quotes about people saying, well, how would I have reacted if actually I had been sent into the townships and so forth? I think I should have at that point gone into Gary Baines's stuff on, I think he's done some very interesting stuff on how whites suffered trauma during their service in the SADF. And perhaps I should have gone there and looked at that. I think that's something I have missed out. I didn't quite pick up your question on Afrikaners, but I think lurking in there was the issue about Afrikaners and their advance in the economy, because what has happened since 94 is a continuation of what happens from the 1960s onwards, the advance of Afrikaner capital. And Afrikaner capital has advanced very considerably, I think, since 1994. Rebecca Davis, not the Rebecca Davis who writes for the Daily Maverick, but another Rebecca Davis, done a very interesting book on Afrikaner's advance in the media, Afrikaner advance in the political economy. And because I had to contain this book, I compressed that into a section. After all, she had written it, so why would I need to repeat it? But it does raise a lot of the issues which perhaps this book will be taken up on, how to relate all that I've written to this whole issue about political economy and whites' continued role as still a dominant force in the economy.
Okay.
Hi. I have a simple question, but perhaps maybe to start by, I disagree that there was no war. There was definitely a war. And currently, at this moment in which we're sitting, there are people who identify themselves as victims of apartheid and the why, victims of apartheid and the war that happened in South Africa. People from all the way from KZN, Eastern Cape, the East Rand are gathered at the Constitutional Hill right now, presently. So there was a war in South Africa, and I think there's sort of like a lot of people who tend to like ignore that. And I think perhaps that's just my own view. My question is rather around how is writing a book around the attitudes of white South Africans and how they think about democracy and, ideas around white privilege. How are they assisting us in terms of thinking about redress and, in terms of, and also thinking also around like, what are the material consequences that we can, speak of and, redressing those things from the material, the cultural, the economic, and not just have a conversation about people who say they acknowledge their white privilege. I think that is, at this point in time, I don't know if that is enough. And I'd like for you to hear more about what you're saying, and like, what are the solutions, or what are people thinking, the people that you have kind of collected this data from, thinking about a way of moving forward, other than saying that we don't see color anymore, or it's a non-racial society, because those things are still very much present. The fact of the matter, that's why I'm saying that there are people right at this point who are old women and men who are sleeping outside of the Constitutional Court, who are speaking, who are still, raising these issues and are not yet seen. Thanks.
Roger, I have a simple question. I mean, maybe it may be taking you somewhere else. I'm Thabo Shido from the Conversation Africa. And my question is, what do you think that the democracy project is unraveling? And what's your prognosis for the next 5 years?
Prognosis. Do you want me to go?
Yeah.
I think the focus groups, well, let me just sort of go back a step, because I do have sort of, at the beginning of the second part of the book, I talk about where whites are today. And incidentally, I've just got to say this, because I love this quote, because sociologists never have time off, because once I was sent off by my wife to a garden centre to get something or other, and I was talking, this was just after COVID, and I was talking to the white owner behind the counter, and I was saying, how do you manage, how's your business done during the COVID? And he was talking about how he'd had to stop paying his staff because he hadn't been able to manage, and he didn't pay them much anyway. And then he came out with this wonderful quote. He said, "If I was black, I'd say, fuck the whites. We never did anything for them." And I thought, that was quite an interesting comment. And I picked that up immediately. But when we're looking at where whites are in the economy today, of course, if you go to what Solidarity is writing about, there's a lot of talk about white downward mobility because of equity employment. And one of these, as I say, one of the narratives which whites still come about with is the unfairness of equity employment. But there's something other I'm going to say about that too. But there is actually something of a reality to white downward mobility. But it's, of course, because white equity employment and so forth has meant that some of the whites at the bottom of the tree have lost their jobs, or not able, or young whites who have no education whatsoever from poor backgrounds don't get the jobs in the post office or the municipality which they would have done before 1994. So there are pockets of poor whites around the countries, and I talk about some of the statistics around that. It's not a huge phenomenon, as you can imagine, but nonetheless, it's a very, I think, potent trope for organizations like Africa Forum and Solidarity. The issue of equity employment and whites' sense of privilege or disprivilege, there is this sense that, oh, look, equity employment means that we're shoved aside, we haven't got a chance, etc., etc. It's not fair. But on the other hand, it was matched in quite some of the comments, a recognition that white privilege is real, and a recognition that whites have favorable access to most of the things which we value. It's always linked, it's always tied up to, oh God, the state is failing. This is go back to when I talk about a failed settler state, I'm talking in the Goran Thurbon term, not talking about the failed state, but to go to Tabo's question about democracy's prospects, then we get the other idea of the failed state and the notion that South Africa under the ANC is on the way down. That definitely coming out of the discussion with whites. But of course, I think that is, somewhere or other, no, I can't remember where I've got it. But what was so fascinating about a lot of this discussion, it came out in looking at white attitudes around the TRC, and it comes out about white attitudes, white participation in politics and so forth. If you look at the IJR survey material, because the IJR is particularly useful on the TRC because it has a list of questions which is followed from 2012. And what is interesting is the way in which the white attitudes it records on its various graphs about complicity in apartheid, was apartheid a crime against humanity, etc. The lines go up and down because IJR does it by race, blacks, coloreds, Indians. What's fascinating is that although the white line is always more conservative than those of the other racial groups, the lines generally follow the same patterns. And when you get to white voting and so forth, again, you get a lot of the same patterns. Again, whites are always more conservative. But what it does suggest is that a lot of the conversation going on amongst whites has its own parallels amongst other racial groups in the country. And I think this is reflected in our general malaise in this country at the moment, the general sense that, yeah, we're not doing too well. We're the general sense that, a lot of people are reluctant to use this term because we don't know what a failed state is until we get there. But a sense that, we're in trouble. So I think one of the challenges after this book would be to see how much these attitudes are recorded on some things are actually mirrored in those of other racial groups.
Okay, we have two more questions. And I think, and in addition, I see, Kifua, you feel like your question was not answered on the idea that there was a war that was avoided.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sorry, okay.
So, but it can come in, Sam?
No, thanks, Roger. And I'm glad I managed to get a copy of the book. So I'll definitely read it. And I was just perusing through and I caught a section around property rights. And I was also the use of the word reluctant Democrat caught my attention. And just listening to you and some of the inputs made, you've written this book at a time when everybody feels some sense of social dislocation, you highly polarized, in all ways, and communities that have huge competing interests. And I'm thinking of the focus groups that you had. What was the geographic bearing to these focus groups? What was the class spatial spread of the focus groups? I'm asking this question because I'm thinking of some of your key research subjects being people who come from non-urban spaces, who are large-scale, farming communities with a very distinct identity, a very peculiar lived experience, 28 years into democracy. And when you locate this narrative within the context of the prevailing politics around redistribution and inequality, and we extend singular attention to Section 25 of the Constitution, how do we measure the scope of this embracement of these freedoms? Is there a limit to this? Because it is only through the arena of the politics of land, and you indicate on page 103 of your book, and it caught my attention, that's one of the major bundle of rights that are very dear to the white community is the property rights. So if we juxtapose that history against your very well-articulated argument, which I connect with, I want to reconcile myself in terms of where do we draw the boundaries? Because you see these ruptures when there is an attempt to infuse some wider conversations around the question of property rights. That almost becomes an area that is highly vexed, and it opens up these fragmentations. So how do we, I think, empirically understand this idea that there are freedoms that these communities are willing to embrace, but against the backdrop of what the country is currently engaged? What kinds of conclusions do we come up with? Thank you very much.
Just of that.
Just of that. Oh, sorry. The questions then. I'll add.
Okay.
Yeah, let's take the questions. Yeah. Kufua? The mic. Yeah.
I'm actually not sure if to ask this question anymore, but I think I'm quite curious about the amount of time being spent about poor whites and those who are unable to get employment and so forth, as if there are no poor blacks who are either graduates or, not also unskilled, that this amount of attention that is placed on poor whites, where else there's a majority of black people who are still, whether they are skilled or unskilled, are not, still getting these jobs. But it becomes a crisis when, this minority group are unable to get, a few jobs and maybe in the unskilled market. But more so to emphasize the fact that, I don't know if you would acknowledge it now or some other time, but that in fact, there was a war in South Africa. And that's, I think, something that needs to be acknowledged for us to be able to have honest conversations to move forward. Perhaps hence why debates or questions around redress and are not taken seriously is because we don't acknowledge the fact that there was a war here in South Africa.
I think mine relates to some of your methodological choices in terms of methodology. Your methodological choices, I think Nonkululeko asked the same question. I think Sam also asked the same question around demographics, because it does shape conclusions you draw. I mean, you made it quite clear when we started that we can't generalize whiteness, and I think then you can also take that statement and reflect it back on the very fact that your demographics do shape the conclusions if they are about whiteness in South Africa in a broader sense. So that's the first thing. So I suppose you can talk to your methodology, because so far I feel like it has not been addressed thoroughly. The second one relates to how whiteness comes to a conclusion that there is crisis, right? Whether it's crisis of decline in democracy, the quality of democracy in South Africa, I think for me, similarly to what Kifo is asking, I wonder, or perhaps I should frame it as a question, do white South Africans or your population in this research regard decline or read decline in relation to their own material conditions, the decline of their own status and so on? That's the question I wanted to.
Okay. I think that's the last question, and then Roger can come in. I think we're about to get to our time. There are refreshments. We can continue the conversation outside. Mzweni?
I was hoping you were not censoring me.
No, I'm not censoring you. I'm just concerned about other matters. As someone who's organized,
like food.
Not food. I have to return other things, so I'm just concerned.
Roger, of course, I haven't had time to go through your book in depth, and of course, I was late. But I have this thing, this kind of like perception, right? That the conversation kind of like revolves around South Africa, like post-apartheid South Africa happened to white people, right? In the same way that maybe we could say apartheid happened to Black people. So you have now Black people that, have a lived reality of apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa happening to them, to your point about access to resources and so on. And then you still also have the same kind of like framing and understanding of being South African and in South Africa as South Africa happening to white people, right? The ANC is not doing well. The DA is like, failed to de-racialize itself. I mean, the DA has gone on a completely messed up project of trying to get of non-racialism, right? And I actually do think that your book would have been better off with reading the FF class rather than the DA, But of course, I mean, I suppose the chapter on the DA does show that what political parties have struggled to kind of like reform, right? So generally, I'm just hearing and thinking through like the idea of South Africa, right? If we think about it as a contested kind of like idea that Black people feel and experience South Africa as happening to them in the sense of victim, right? Still victims of X, Y, Z. And then you also have white people who I don't understand, by the way, but I know that there are Xhosas and Zulus and Tswanas. But when we speak about white people, I'm aware that there are probably Greek nationals that and Jewish people and Afrikaners, and I'm pretty sure that white people are just not all the same. I think maybe, right? And so I'm very interested in understanding the kind of like belonging understandings that different kinds of white people that have different levels of access to resources and histories in South Africa, construct their post 1994 kind of like identity and how they experience their life in South Africa. Of course, like I said, I haven't had a chance to go through it, right? But I do have a sense that if we are going to speak about whiteness and whites in a democracy in South Africa, you would have written a chapter on Blacks in development if it was about Black people. But I don't get a sense of, the role that white people have played in the reconstruction and development of South Africa. I see there's whites in liberal democracy and that kind of thing, but there are like a couple of things that are, necessarily missing that, of course, having read a lot of your work, since you're going to pass my PhD, Yeah, I'm not getting the same kind of if we're asking and pushing the same kinds of questions that we pose to a Black elite or Black leadership and Black people in general, having, you know, that are in charge of this so-called state.
Sorry, Sam was
So he had asked about section 25.
about
Section 25 of the Constitution. And it's centering in these debates, especially he cited page 80 something where you speak about white farmers here.
I'm just going to have to say.
Yeah.
Okay. Of course, there was. Yeah, sorry. No, you want this on, don't you? Yeah, there was. Yeah, if I'm giving the impression that I am trying to, what's the word, not diminish, but ignore the violence and the trauma inflicted on Black people during the transition, then I'm at fault in the book. I seem to remember that between the years 1900 and 94, there was something like 18,000 people, violent deaths in this country. That's a lot of people. But I don't like that word, but this was not the race war which was predicted by those people, the analysts in the 1980s. Much of the violence which, we know a lot of the violence within Black communities between 1994 was instigated by Third Force and so forth. We know that a lot of the violence in KZN, which was particularly brutal, was taken up in terms of in Carter versus UDF and so forth. And again, a lot of outside instigation. This is pretty ugly stuff. And of course, people were traumatized by it. But it wasn't the sort of race war which was predicted. This wasn't straightforward white versus Black. I think we have to get away from simplicities like that. It was not the whole issue of whites being pushed into the sea, which was the fear of many whites during the 1980s. It was not what Fredrickson was talking about when I cited him in 1981. The methodology, now I think we can talk about focus groups later. I'm not quite sure where I take that one. Am I writing that South Africa is happening to whites, and whereas it's much more important to write on or consider Black poverty and so forth? We know perfectly well that the people at the bottom in this country, their condition of life has not improved since 1994. I think I'm going to answer that in a very simple way. You may fault my choice of subject, but that was my choice of subject. And if I am choosing that particular subject, then I am going to focus on whites rather than Blacks, which would be a very different book. It's, as I say, you can fault my decision to write this book. That's perfectly legitimate, but I I still think that it's important that we consider the role of minority. We are the only country in the world, bar Namibia, bar a few odds and sods around the continent. We are the only significant white minority, the only country with a significant white minority which is ruled by people of another skin color. And that is a result of history. So I think there is something unique about this country that is worth investigating and justifies the choice to look at whites today in South Africa. So I have to leave it there, and if I'm quite expecting to get criticism for the choice, but there we are. There's no free lunch in social sciences.
Okay.
Sam, I'm going to have to come back to you later.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks everyone for joining us. I have to dash off, so I'll join you all in the foyer for the conversation that's going to continue. And thanks, Roger, for being with us. Daniella, thanks. Nonkululeko, thanks. Sam, Prishani, thanks. Tez, Norma, thank you. Yeah. Thank you.